Hi, these are my revision notes, my study notes that I scribbled down when I was studying for the ITIL4 foundation exam. It's a bit of a brain dump, if you like. It's my own revision stuff that I did, and I hope this will help if you're studying towards your ITIL4 foundation exam. These are just my scribbles, my notes. So first off, I scribbled down about identifying the key concepts and the elements of ITIL4, particularly making sure I was familiar with things like explaining the guiding principles and knowing them, knowing about the dimensions and the factors, the service value system, which was abbreviated to SVS, the service value chain, abbreviated to SVC, the practices as well. And then I noted that it was asking about recalling the purpose of a set of practices, and then another set of practices. It talked about knowing the definitions, recognizing and understanding the value mapping piece and the benefits of doing that, and then stuff about benefits that it can bring to an organization, as well as I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent really, and just kind of looking at, what are the mistakes that you might take if you were implementing ITIL in your organization. And then again, not for the exam necessarily, but just for background information, I wanted to get a bit of a better understanding, as I was from an ITIL3 background. What was this ITIL4 all about? What changed? What was the difference? And I also then put some quizzes for myself, that I just wrote myself, and kind of flashcards really. So I'll cover some of those. So then in terms of the history, I wanted to just make sure I fully understood the history of ITIL overall, and then yeah, those guiding principles, dimensions, service value system, service value chain. Although I did look at all of the 34 management practices, I noticed that the syllabus talked about making sure you understood the purpose and the definition of a whole bunch of them. But I did kind of look at all of them just for interest really. So I was from an ITIL3 background anyway, so I knew all the stuff around. It was a widely accepted IT service management approach, and that version 1 went way back into 1980, late 1980s, 89 I think. I got involved in ITIL way back in version 2, which was kind of early 2000s, and then progressed on to version 3, which was 2007 I think, and then followed that and updated that to the 2011 version. And then I was mindful that 2019 had come along, and ITIL4 was there. But as I say, I was from an ITIL3 background, so I kind of knew all the base stuff about it. It came from government agency during the 80s, and they wanted to address the lack of quality in IT services and all of that good stuff. My thinking was around, okay, well, I'll do the foundation exam first, and then I'll look at the different ways, the different directions. There seemed to be a couple of streams as I understood it. There was a strategic leader direction, and then a managing professional course. My leaning was kind of more to the managing professional course at the time. So then I just made sure I was familiar with the guiding principles. So there's 7 of them. They're focusing on value, starting where you are, progressing iteratively with feedback, working collaboratively, and promoting visibility. I also made a note here in my notes about difference between collaboration and cooperation. Thinking and working holistically, looking at the big picture type stuff, keeping it simple, keeping it practical, and automating and optimizing. So for me, it was about making sure I understood those 7 guiding principles as to what they were, and being able to call them off, but then understanding a little more about each one. So focusing on value, for example. I'm reading my handwriting here, and I think I can just about make it out. It says something about everything an organisation does and needs to go to value, so it's mapped directly to value. And then just consider customer experience. It was about the value principle And then starting where you are, I kind of common sense stuff, just try and avoid starting from scratch where you can. What's available, is there anything that can be leveraged? And I put in brackets here about understanding the current state. So where are you? What is the as is situation? The progressing iteratively with feedback, I made a point here and I kind of underlined it about avoid try to do everything at once, organize it into smaller bits, into more manageable sections that you can execute in a timely manner. And then I put about this feedback bit, make sure you're feeding back, make sure you're keeping people informed. The collaborative and promoting visibility point, I think the main point I put here was about making sure you go across the different boundaries. So in lots of organisations, there's different departments, different regions, different cultures, each making sure that everyone was kind of working on the same page. Holistic. So I wrote here that no service is an island. So that any kind of service includes people, it includes agreements, it includes partners. There's obviously the technology bit to it. So making sure that that holistic picture is looked at rather than just trying to look at it's an application. Well, yeah, but there's a server connected to it, or there's a network, or there's a a data center or a service provider somewhere along the line. And then keeping it simple and practical is kind of fundamentally, is it what you're doing, is it actually useful, is it delivering an outcome? And then the automation and optimizing bit, I think I can just about make out my writing here that says about repetitive activities. Look at stuff that you're doing on a regular basis, or it's a large amount of activities that it's the same activity all the time. Look at a better way of doing that, trying to think a bit smarter rather than working harder. um, I also noticed as I was looking at the guiding principles and as I was studying them, I noticed that it seems to reflect some of these things are not new. It talks these some of these principles kind of touch other philosophies or body of knowledges or methods, frameworks, standards, that kind of stuff. Um, like I noticed some stuff mentioned in COBIT or DevOps and Agile and Lean as well. So then I looked at the 4 dimensions and the factors. So it was about getting my head around, okay, what are those 4 dimensions? The organisation and people, the information and technology, the partners and suppliers, and the value streams and processes, and just understanding the PESTLE factors. So just not only memorizing them as, okay, what are those factors, which are political, economical, social, technological, and legal, and environmental factors. It was just knowing that every dimension, those 4 dimensions, excuse me, these PESTLE factors kind of affected them, and they all kind of influence each other. I liked to kind of understand that as they are the ingredients. If it's a recipe, if you like, I kind of wrote it down as they're ingredients. If you want to create something of high quality, so like a product or a service, for example, and something that is good and has value, these are the ingredients, and that they all influence each other. So then I dug down into a bit more detail on each of those dimensions. So the organisation and people, I made a note around the structure of the organisation, the hierarchy, the roles, responsibilities, and I noticed I highlighted this bit. Is it geared to enable value creation? So looking at the organisation structure and the people, and can the activities that each one of those roles does, the outcomes, the output of it, is it mapped clearly to an actual role And then culture, is it a collaborative culture? That word seems to come up quite a lot. That is the environment one of a collaborative nature? And at the time when I was studying the exam, I knew of a couple of departments that I mean, I won't mention them here, but in my notes, I'd sort of said, yeah, that's a really good point. If I think of Department A and Department B, and their areas are, they're not really collaborative. That's not really helping matters. But yeah, it was about, are they delivering value? Are they operating? Or I think they were just operating processes and technologies for the sake of it, rather than actually thinking around the value to the customer. It was, this is what we do, this is our bit, and not really looking, um, and working collaboratively. And then the capacity, I sort of made a note about, do they have enough people? Is there enough skills, enough people? Governance at the time was something, it was an organisation where it was a regulated organisation, so it was important there were proper governance structures, but also making sure that it had that flexibility against the risk. So were people able to make decisions? Did they have the authority to do stuff and maybe be a little creative, but managing that against the risk, making sure that people don't have a complete free rein to do anything, and just make sure there's a balance there. And then competency, making sure people were skilled and trained and were working in an efficient manner. Communication, I just made a point there as are the practices supporting communication, and then the interfaces, where are the different touch points between the teams, so the wider AS business units. So then what I then looked at was the other dimension around information and technology. So what information is needed to create or deliver value. I thought about the technical components that made up a service. So again, just kind of thinking about no service is an island, that each service would have, there would be compute requirement, there would be processing requirement, there would be storage, digital interfaces, network, and just making sure that they were all there and understood. And then also what information was needed to support service management and the capabilities there. So did we know about the volumes? Do we know capacity, demand, infrastructure, costs, of course? Basically, what were the aspects of service management to run an efficient service portfolio? Yeah, and kind of touched on technology that was needed. So process automation, database, service catalog, queue management, event logging, analytics, reporting, CMDB, all of that good stuff in order to support service management. And then last but by no means least was the security bit, is just making sure from an information and technology dimension, security wasn't a kind of an also ran. It wasn't something that was added in at the last minute. Actually, no, it was needed to be put in right at the beginning, right at the design stage. The other dimension I looked at and digged into a bit more detail was partners and suppliers, particularly looking at the strategy, the scarcity of resources, cost, relationships, and flexibility. And then the final dimension I made sure I was familiar with and understood was about value streams and processes. So I can read here, I've underlined, consider how the work happens and why is it happening. So like focusing on value as an example. So the service value chain was an operating model and is an operating model that looks where you map value streams. So again, the delivery of how are you actually doing, it's the delivery process of a server, and it maps that activity flowing through the demand. So certainly looking at value streams and process definitions as to were they clear, is it actually delivering value, why why would we be doing something, and really kind of exploring that and questioning that as to what are the steps. Perhaps is there an automation opportunity there? How come a human's doing it? Maybe a third party could do it. So it was that kind of stuff. And then finally, around the dimensions and the factors, was looking at the factors overall. So dimensions are affected by multiple factors, and those are political, economical, social, technical, legal, environmental. And I wrote some examples down as to political might be government policy, political stability, corruption, maybe the tax policy or some kind of labour law in that country, or trade restrictions of some kind. Economical, I thought of examples around exchange rates or interest rate fluctuations or inflation perhaps, but also thinking about, do people have disposable income, how much disposable income, and unemployment rate as well. Social, my notes said here about population growth, age distribution, attitudes to careers generally, attitudes towards safety, attitudes towards health and lifestyle. Technological, I put here around innovation, automation, R&D activity, general awareness of technology. Legal, I put stuff around, is there any copyright or patent stuff, or consumer protection laws, employment laws, health and safety, that kind of stuff. And then the final factor, which is environmental, I put weather, climate, policies, pressure groups as kind of examples. So the next bit I looked at was the service value system. I wrote down here, it's a model to represent how all the components and the activities, kind of how they all pitch in and deliver value together through various systems, and it's sort of its components that create those values to stakeholders. In a nutshell, for a service to run correctly, you need to put something into it. It needs an input, and that input, that trigger, that starter, if you like, was something called opportunity and demand. And the service value system talks about having this initial trigger point, this opportunity, whatever it is, opportunity for a new product, or an opportunity for a new piece of business or a new service. So there was this concept of a trigger point that started it all off, and that was called opportunity and demand. And then within the service value system, there were lots of sensible things there that you would expect in any kind of system or any kind of structure that talks about what are the principles, what are the guiding principles, what about governance, this service value chain that I'll come on to in a moment. Practices, there's different types of practices in there. They were split out into 3 different types of practices. There was the general management practice stuff, there was service management practice stuff, and there was technical management practice stuff. And then all of that, the output here was delivering value to an organization, delivering value to a customer, delivering value to a stakeholder. So in my head, I kind of pictured this arrow that started at the original opportunity and demand. It ended with the delivery of the value, and then there was a whole bunch of things: guiding principles, governance, service value chain, practices, and continual improvement in the middle, and that delivered the value. So yeah, that was just kind of my notes really. I went into a bit more detail on each one. So guiding principles were recommendations that an organisation can use, and I noticed the ITIL book talked about that it was it's recommendations that can guide an organisation in all circumstances, regardless of changes in goals, strategies, type of work, or management structure. So I kind of memorised that as a what's a guiding principle. And then the governance piece, I just wrote down here. It's about direction. It's about control. Service value chain. I'll talk in. I think it's on the next page. Is it on the next page? Yeah, it is. I'm going to be talking about the service value chain in a bit more detail. But it was a load of activities that a company will use, and it delivers that product or delivers that service to the stakeholder, to the customer, and it basically delivers value. I think the terminology was around facilitating value, so facilitate value realization. So that was just my note around it. It was a set of activities. It produced the product and the service, which in turn delivered that value piece. And then the practices. So I did probably go into more detail than I needed to be fair, for the practices. I looked at all of them. So there's 34 split over general service management and technological, so technical management practices. For the foundation piece, you didn't need to know all 34. It was that there was a requirement to understand the purpose and the definitions of a bunch of them, and we'll come on to those in a minute. And then the continual improvement piece was, well, as it might really sound, it's about continual improvement of that service or that product. And I made a note at the time, there was a model there around keeping momentum going in improvement activities, but it was very much about understanding what was the business trying to do, where was it going, what were the headline goals, the vision, and then doing some kind of baseline assessment. What is the as is situation? From memory, it was where are we now, I think, and it was all about just saying what's the current state, basically, and then work out, all right, fine, this is where we are, where do we want to go, where are we heading for, where's the target? Is it top of that mountain, just over the hill, 10 miles away? Where is it we're actually going? And then I made a point here, what does that say? Oh yeah, about measuring, so defining some kind of measurement or target to work towards. And then clearly there's the element of then, okay, fine, we know where we are, we know where we want to be, how do we get there? And that was the improvement plan. Then there was the, right, fine, now you've got to do it, you've got to execute it, and then looking at those metrics as to, did we actually get there? Did we get to the top of the hill? Did we get to the top of the mountain? And then keeping that momentum going. So the service value chain bit I looked into. So my notes here say it's part of the service value system. In fact, it's at the centre. Exclamation mark is what I put. So the service value chain, it's like a tool set for practitioners, an operating model for creation of delivery of continual improvements. It maps. Oh yeah, so this was a key point for me. I really kind of underlined this and highlighted it with my bright yellow marker. It was about a way of mapping demand to value. So I really quite like that. It was, you have this kind of concept of, you've got the opportunity and the demand, and you need to get to the value piece by creating whatever it is, a product or a service, and this service value chain basically maps that demand journey to the end result of value. And there's some steps in there: planning, improving, engaging, designing, transitioning, obtaining, building, delivering, and supporting. And I wrote down an acronym here, which was PIDOD, to help me remember that. PIEDOD. So planning, improving, engaging, designing, transitioning, obtaining, building, and delivering and support. Yeah, and they were the steps that you use to create value, and then each of those activities, so like the obtain and build, for the sake of argument, there's an input that goes into it and there's an output. And I kind of drew it out on a blank piece of paper and had a pencil and just mapped various activities. I did an incident from memory, and just drew out, okay, well, from the demand, how do you get to the value piece, and then followed with my pencil the journey going from planning, improving, engaging, design, transition, obtain, build, deliver, and support to get to that, final product, that final service. Yeah, so all of those elements are kind of interconnected, and there's triggers for each one of those. Yeah, and the service value chain, it can also be adapted to other approaches as well, so like DevOps or centralized IT. So it was a really neat, flexible way of kind of mapping demand to value. So that was really what I'd written down around the chain, really. What else have I written here? So it always started with demand. That was the other point I kind of made an underline to, if you like, was that the start of the service value chain, there was that initial trigger, which was demand, and the end result was the value piece. And it was a series of steps to create or to deliver your product, whatever that may be, or your IT service, or your end result. Maybe you fixed an incident. Yeah, so that was really kind of my main point around service value chain. I don't think there was anything else I can talk through. Yeah, I did map, and I noticed in the book there was some kind of case studies, some examples of value chain activities, and value stream mapping. There was an incident where you kind of mapped it through from demand to engage to deliver and support, and improve and engage, and then the value piece. So it was quite a fun exercise, really, because I literally just had a pencil and just drew a squiggly line from the original point of demand. So the user is using an IT service, and he's got a problem, and it needed to be resolved because the person couldn't continue doing their day-to-day work. It was impacting business operations. And then I just sort of mapped it through from engaging. So in practical terms, that, well, okay, they're going to phone the service desk, aren't they? They're going to go, it's bust, it doesn't work, there's something wrong. And then it goes through the incident management activity, where you're logging it, you're categorizing it, you're prioritizing it, hopefully setting some kind of expectation with the user to say, okay, we're on it, it's going to take 2 hours to fix, or whatever. And then following that through, right through to the deliver and support, where maybe there was a subject matter expert in an assignment group who looked at it and went, oh yeah, I know what the problem is. They need to get a fix of some kind, or downloaded something, or get that that solution, and they then resolve it. And kind of side note I just made was, okay, yeah, that's going to be hitting things like the incident management process, the asset management process, service configuration. Maybe there might have been a change elements to that, depending on what that change was, and if they needed to do some kind of radical change to the system. Maybe it's an emergency change, maybe it's a normal change. Yeah, so that was a useful exercise, and to get your head around that, I definitely recommend just doing that, and map something. Think of something that's happened in your organisation, and go, all right then, how would that work in terms of a service value chain? Let's go from the demand right through to the value. And also in the book, I did it and followed the instructions in the manual around a regulatory change in an IT system software, and I followed sort of the example in the book, but I also did it another way, where I kind of thought, I've come from a regulated environment, and I kind of thought through, yeah, I remember a Sarbanes-Oxley change, come to think of it, and there was something within the regulation that meant there needed to be greater oversight and governance relating to third-party vendors. So I kind of just mapped that through just as my own experience as to how did that work from the demand, from the engage, from the planning, the obtaining, right through to that value, and then at the end there was an improvement element. So I'd strongly urge you to do that. It's a good way of just really setting it in. Then I looked at the management practices. So I kind of made a note that there were more service management practices than there were general management practices, and the least amount of practices were the technical management practices. I don't know whether that meant anything or not, but I just said in my notes here, there's 17 service management practices, there are 14 general management practices, and there were only 3 technical management practices. So the technical management practices were things like deployment management, infrastructure, how you manage the infrastructure and the platform, and then software dev and management. The service management practices, as you might imagine, are things like incident, asset, monitoring, event management, problem, capacity, availability, catalog, that kind of stuff. Service desk is in there, and request management. And then the general management practices were things like architecture or continual improvement, security, knowledge management, relationship, and supplier management, that kind of stuff. I did make a note that in the exam for the foundation, in my study notes, not to necessarily dig into detail on all of those 34 practices, and just made a side note to say, make sure you get your head around A, the service value chain, and B, the practices, but don't go into a huge amount of detail on all of the practices, because there seem to be a subset. So then just over the page here, and I'm looking at my scribbles here, I wrote out kind of right, just memorize this, get this in your head. And it talked about service value chain activities, the practices, the guiding principles, the governance, what that meant, and the continual improvement. So for the service value chain, I just wrote PIDOD. So remember that it was about planning, it was improving, it was engaging, designing and transitioning, obtaining and building, delivering and supporting, and that was it. And then the practices, that was about just making sure I'd got my head around, okay, well, there's 3 sections to the practices. These are the general management practices, the service management practices, and the technological practices. And then the guiding principles as well. So I just made sure I kind of understood these. And I'd come from a sort of different environments where I'd kind of recognised some of these guiding principles anyway. But, the ITIL4 guiding principles talk about focusing on value, starting where you are, progressing iteratively and feedback, collaborating and being visible, working, but also thinking holistically, keeping it simple and keeping it practical, and then optimizing. The governance bit, my notes simply say here around, it's about directing and controlling the organisation. And then continual improvement, I'm sure I've got some more notes on continual, I have further on about the improvement model. There's a 7-step improvement model. So that was what I'd put there, and the elements and the concepts of each practice. I made a side note here that there was 26 processes in ITIL3, and there's now 34 practices in ITIL4 via the service value system. I kind of made a note for ITIL3 was there were 26 processes and there was this life cycle going on with strategy, design, transition, operations, and continual improvement. And then I just compared that to, oh, that's interesting, there's 34 practices in ITIL4 and there's this service value system. The other point I made was around incident management. So the purpose of incident management was about minimizing the negative incidents, the negative impact of incidents, and restoring normal service as quickly as possible. And that was the purpose. So the purpose of incident management is to minimize the negative impact of incidents by restoring normal service operation as quickly as possible. So I kind of put an asterisk next to that to say, remember that, learn that. And that the other side note I put here was, and it's pretty common sense really, incident management has a massive effect on customer and user expectation. So customers, regardless of all the other good stuff you do behind the scenes, if something's bust and it doesn't work and they phone the service desk up, the incident management has a massive perception point around how your stakeholders, your customers see and how they perceive the service. And yeah, the service value chain activities, there was a strong emphasis around engagement and deliver and support in the value chain activities. The other bit I kind of made sort of a few asterisks next to it, and again this is me coming from an ITIL3 background into an ITIL4, was that I noticed ITIL4 seemed to be less prescriptive about processes, and it kind of shifted the focus on the 34 practices, giving up the company and the organisations a bit more freedom, if you like, to define, to tailor, to adapt them to the particular requirements of that organisation. So it was just kind of a general point when I was thinking through incident management about logging, categorisation, prioritisation, investigation, comms, resolutions, reviews and closure. I just made that kind of note there that it does seem less prescriptive, and it's more emphasis on those practices, but and those practices are describing key activities, inputs, outputs, and the various roles. And the point seemed to kind of talk around its guidance for organisations to design a process, in this case that just happened to be focusing in on incident management, but there was definitely seemed to be sort of, this is guidance, design your own process for managing incidents that's going to fit your specific requirements, your particular organisation. While I was kind of on the incident management trail, I noticed another thing called swarming, and I'd heard of swarming from other areas being in an agile environment, but the swarming term from an ITIL4 perspective, it was a new term, if you like. It was introduced as part of the ITIL4 framework, and as I say, agile teams have been doing this for a while, but the concept is that it's a technique for solving, however you want to term it, various really complicated tasks. So in the model of swarming, you've got lots of people with different areas of expertise, different subject matter experts, and they all work together on a task. So they all swarm like a swarm of bees, if you like, until it's clear, until people have got their head around, oh, okay, so we need a person that knows about this, a person that knows about this, and a person that knows about this, and we need that vendor. So once that's been established, that swarm then sort of dilutes, and just those people that are needed work collaboratively to then fix that. So the old model was more kind of escalation. It was more process based. You had an L1, you had an L2, and then an L3. The swarming model is kind of, if you like, everyone looks at it, a whole bunch of people look at it. Once it's clear what the problem is, and people have been identified, or areas of expertise have been identified, they stick to it and they sort it, and then the other people go off. And then, as with ITIL3, the other bit I'd kind of underlined here was about interfaces with other areas and other practices. So incident management touches loads of different areas: problem management, change management, service desk, obviously, service requests, change management, change enablement, continuity, platform management, even project management or release management, and software dev. So it was just really kind of a nod to, don't just think incident management stands on its own. It interfaces with a whole ton of different areas. I can't see anything else really there. That yeah, I'd kind of re-underlined about the ITIL3 view of incident management. You had a kind of a process map in terms of the steps that you needed to go through, and the emphasis in ITIL4 seemed less prescriptive, and it's kind of advising companies to say, okay, here's some good ideas, here's some guidance, this will work, but adapt it, think through what's going to work in your organization. And then not necessarily for the exam, I just wrote, and this was purely just out of interest really, was having come from an ITIL3 perspective, this ITIL4, what are the differences? There seems to be, there's bits that are kind of changed, and I just wanted to kind of get my head around those quickly. So I went off and spent a morning just comparing and looking through some of my old manuals and information and knowledge I had, and just doing a bit of what's ITIL3, what's ITIL4, and I came up with a table that talks about the main differences. So ITIL3, for example, there were 9 guiding principles, whereas in ITIL4 there were 7. I noticed about there was different certification levels, and that had changed. And then also the life cycle didn't seem to be there in version 4. So version 3 talked about the service life cycle as strategy. So service strategy, service design, service transition, service ops, and CSI. I couldn't see that in ITIL4. There seemed to be the service value system. So that was the replacement, if you like. So it was not so much the life cycle, it was the service value system. And then things like there was a few sort of the 4 Ps. So as an example, people, process, partners, product. The concept had shifted more along to things like dimensions, so those organizations and people, information technology, partners and suppliers, and value streams. I definitely noticed a terminology change. There were subtle terminology changes. So as a really good example, incident in the ITIL3 world, an incident was defined as an unplanned interruption to a service or reduction in the quality of an IT service, whereas in ITIL4 it's pretty much the same, apart from one word is dropped, which is IT. So ITIL4 talks about an unplanned interruption to a service or reduction in the quality of a service. Note that actually opened up to enterprise service management, so I thought that was really cool. But yeah, the ITIL3 world talks about reduction in the quality of an IT service, whereas ITIL4 talked about reduction in the quality of a service, dropping the IT. And then service definition was, in ITIL3, it was a means of delivering value to the customer by facilitating outcomes without undergoing specific cost or risk. ITIL4 talked more around a service being, it's about value co-creation by facilitating the outcomes that a customer wants to achieve without undergoing any cost or risk. And then also the CSI model in ITIL4, the terminology was the continual improvement CI model. But definitely I noticed a real shift in language, more business focused, more new ways of working, new approaches. And I'd scribbled down a couple of examples here around change enablement practice. So there was a change control and change enablement that kind of started to shift. Techniques as well. So I mentioned a few moments ago the technique that was used in Agile previously around swarming. It's a good idea, of course. Processes were now practices. New ways of working. There was a real kind of, I felt there was a nod to the Agile way of working, the lean way of working, looking at waste, DevOps type ways of working. And then personally, I felt there was a much stronger emphasis on value and co-creation. More, there was more activity, being more active with the customer. And the other point I put down there really was about this less prescriptive. We talked about incident management, for example. So ITIL4 felt much more, okay, what's going to work in your organization, adapt it to what is going to work. This is the good practice. So, consider these good practice elements. Now adapt that to your organization. And I thought that was really clever in terms of being able to look at something and then say, okay, well, maybe that's just not going to work in this particular organization. Let's adapt it slightly. So there was a definite less sort of prescriptive element. And then the governance piece felt much greater emphasis in ITIL4 around governance, and it's present in the service value system, and it talks a lot more around directing and control. Okay, now I noticed here, I then went off and created some flashcards on my computer at the time around ITIL4 quick questions for me to just flash up in front of me and then go, okay, go on then, what's the answer? So my question here was, what are the 4 dimensions of service management? Hopefully you'll have the answer here as organisation and people, information and technology, partners and suppliers, and then finally value streams and processes. My next little question for myself was around, go on then, what are the 7 guiding principles in ITIL4? And those are focusing on value, starting where you are, progressing iteratively with feedback, collaboration, promoting visibility, holistically, I just wrote here, but that was kind of thinking and working holistically, keeping it simple and practical, and then I put automation, but it's kind of optimizing and automating. Then my other quick fire question to myself was, what are the factors that affect the dimensions? Now I just wrote PESTLE here as I'd kind of memorized this, but after a while, but it was the political, the economical, the social, technical, legal, and environmental factors, and those are those factors that every dimension is affected by multiple factors. Then to test myself, I said, go on then, what are the 5 service value system components? And those are the guiding principles, the governance, service value chain, practices. What did I put here? Oh yeah, there's 34 practices. I've gone into perhaps a little more detail than I needed to, but the practices, 34 practices, split into general, service management, technical. And then the continual improvement piece. I'll put a side note here that opportunity and demands the beginning and values the end. Yeah. Okay, and then was this my last question? Yeah. The question was around what are the stages in the service value chain? Now, again, the way I just happen to work, and I seem to memorize things using acronyms. I put PIDOD here, so that's plan, improve, engage, design and transition, obtain and build, deliver and support. Oh, and then I put there was a flashcard here about what's utility and what's warranty. So utility is functionality offered by a product or a service to meet a particular need. Utility answers the question, what does it do? What does your service actually do? And is it fit for purpose? So does it support the performance of the stakeholder, the customer, the consumer? Does it help remove constraints from does it help remove constraints from them? And then warranty, I put about assurance, that I'd underlined assurance here, interestingly. I think it's kind of how I tend to remember warranty. It's assurance. That's how, the simple answer, what's warranty? It's assurance. But it's assurance a product or a service is going to meet the agreed requirements, and it's about how the service performs. Is it fit for use? Typically, in my experience, it's been things like continuity management. What happens if something goes horribly wrong? What about the security bits to it? Is it secure? Does it meet the various requirements? Perhaps there's certain security standards that need to be met. What about capacity? What about availability? Is it 5 nines, or is there other elements? And then service levels. Yeah, another kind of nod really here around incident management and the steps. So I drew out a cycle here around logging, categorizing, prioritizing, investigating, that communication piece. And I'd put a little arrow to myself here around major incident management and bridges and so on and so forth, and links into other interfaces into incident management, like change management or problem management. And then the resolution and review activities and the closure. My main point really around the incident management point was it's less prescriptive. So here's some guidelines. This is how you could run it. This is the best practice approach to running it, but adapt it. It was definitely less prescriptive there. And then I just made a note around interfaces specifically, monitoring and event management, perhaps some other examples, service request management, continuity, some of those dev and platform management interfaces. So it was really to kind of make sure I'd got that clear. Service management is a set of specialized organizational capabilities. I just wrote that randomly in the middle of my notes. I don't know why I did, but it's a good thing to know. Service management, it's a set of specialized organizational capabilities. Right, okay, so on the next page here, I've got some information I wrote down about generic roles in IT. So what have I got here? That the roles defined in ITIL aren't compulsory. It is non-descriptive. You don't have to have all of these roles, and the emphasis is around your particular environment, your organisation. You're going to know what's going to work best and what's needed. So adapt to your own needs based on, it could be the industry, it could be the approach, it could be the culture, it could be the environment, it could be the type of company. But here are some roles that when you think about organisational structures and people as one of those 4 dimensions, think more along the lines of don't sort of go, oh, ITIL says you have to have this kind of role. Think of it in a different way. Think of it along the lines of, okay, what roles do we need to fill? What are the people? What kind of skills do we need? What do we want people to do? I quite like to always boil it down to, and especially in job descriptions, if there's one thing, if there's one sentence or one skill that is the must have, what is it? If you want one person to be the best at, what is it? So if a customer's, if the role is a customer facing role, as an example, you would hope that you're going to want somebody who has good customer facing skills. They have to have that. Technical skills may be important, but perhaps less important than, can you stick this person in front of the customer? That's the number one skill. Perhaps they still do need to be technical, but the number one, boil it down, one skill, you would say they've got to be customer facing. And then say, okay, well, what's the number two? Perhaps it's technical in this case. What's the number three? Perhaps administration skills. Now, that dovetails really nicely into things like a racy matrix. So you want to make sure you've got the right people in the right roles doing the right things. And a racy matrix is really good at working out who's responsible for a particular activity, who's accountable, where does the buck stop, who do we need to consult, who do we need to keep informed. But if we go on from that, ITIL4 talks about role competencies, and there's 5 role competency profiles that help with this whole concept of roles. So they are leader, administrator, coordinator / communicator, methods and technique expert, and then tech expert. I've memorized that as LACMT, LACMT. So leader is about decision making, delegating, overseeing activities, motivation, evaluating outcomes, perhaps incentives. Administrator, assigning, prioritization of tasks, record keeping, reporting. Maybe there's a monthly report or a daily report or a quarterly report. And initiating improvements, usually basic, low-level improvements. And then the coordinator, communicator, so coordination of multiple parties. Perhaps those are internal parties, perhaps they're external parties, perhaps they're service providers, but stakeholder communication, maybe running awareness campaigns. And then the methods and techniques expert, so someone who's good at designing, implementing techniques, good at documentation, standard operating procedures, run books, process consolidation or consultation, analysis, continual improvement, CI type activities. And then the technical expert, so well, as the profile sounds, a technical techie, a subject matter expert, someone who's good at assignments, technical work for delivery or support or resolution. So LAC MT was what I'd written down. Then I written a couple of examples here. CAT role profile. So C being the most important element was the communication and coordination skills were really important, followed by admin skills following that, still important but not as important as the communication and coordination. And then T would be technical skills, so they need to have good technical skills, but it's not as important as their administrative skills, if you like, in terms of prioritizing tasks and record keeping and reporting and so on. But most important is their communication and coordination skills. So business relationship management, or someone who's front of house with a stakeholder relationship, is a really good example of that. And maybe that's an internal stakeholder, maybe that's an external stakeholder or a customer, or maybe it's a service owner or a service manager or service delivery manager type role. And then the TMA role as another example. So T is the technical bit, so that's the most important bit. If you boiled down the job description of the person who has a role competency profile of a TMA, you would say Well, the number one boiled down item is you've got to be technical. So you're a techie first, followed by methods, design skills. So, maybe designing, implementing techniques, good at documentation, good at standard operating procedures, run books, procedures, process analysis, that kind of good stuff. And then A was the admin piece. I'd put down here a service owner perhaps, or a change manager. So really just think about the job descriptions and the objectives, and it's a competency role based model just as an approach. So think about those 5 role competency profiles, and I memorized it as LAC MT: leader, administrator, coordinator, methods and techniques. And also I'd written here, and I don't think it was necessary for the exam as such, but I did kind of went off on a bit of a tangent in terms of looking at things like hybrid roles, and I looked at pie-shaped communication and awareness, and T-shaped positions where you've got a broad level of knowledge in one area and you're a specialist in another, and then I-shaped. So you're a subject matter expert on one area but no knowledge of other areas, which isn't great. So it's good to be aware of these in terms of ITIL exams and understanding. Yeah, I probably went into a lot more detail than needed, and I went into detail on I-shaped individuals, T-shaped individuals, pie-shaped individuals, and combi-shaped individuals, and looked at breadth of knowledge versus depth of knowledge. So it's sort of breadth and depth analysis. Yeah, and then just looking into a bit more detail on some of the generic roles that I'd seen in ITIL4 previously, and just trying to get my head around those in terms of where does that fit into ITIL4. So I'd written down here service owners, process managers, practice owners, product owners, and change manager. And briefly the notes around each one. So service owner in terms of managing usually one or more services through from kind of start to finish, and looking at how that's delivering value. And then a bit more detail around process owner, process manager, practice owner, product owner, change manager. I didn't go into a huge amount of detail on roles. My key takeaway was around the role competency profiles, that leader, administrator, coordinator, methods and technique expert, and tech expert. I think that was the key learning for me from an ITIL perspective. Yeah, and I'd obviously gone off just sort of looking at, okay, well, if I do the ITIL4 foundation exam, what am I going to do after that? And I looked at the 2 options that were presented to me, which was the ITIL managing professional and the ITIL strategic leader. So the managing professional was around the create, deliver and support in particular that I was interested in, and then going on to the driving stakeholder value and the high velocity IT, and then the direct, plan and improve. And I just kind of sort of looked into each one of those as to a bit more detail, and that was the path that I took. I decided to go down the managing professional step first of all, and then I was still interested in this. I was less interested in it immediately, but I then went on to follow that. The ITIL strategic leader, which was the ITIL strategist, direct, plan and improve, and the digital and IT strategy. So it was really just a kind of a side note. The ITIL4 foundation exam, I'd scribbled down here, it's multiple choice, that there's 40 questions, so you need to get 65%, and it's you've got an hour and it's a closed book. I also made a note here that there are sample papers available. There's sort of past papers to go through. Okay, so then I focused in on definitions, because I noticed there was quite a lot of talk about making sure you've got these definitions in your head. So I focused on service, utility, warranty, customer, user, service management, sponsor, IT asset, event, configuration, item, change, incident, problem, and known error. So for my notes, I've got service, that it's a means of enabling value, co-creation by facilitating outcomes that customers want to achieve without the customer having to manage specific costs and risks. Utility, I put about the functionality offered by a product to meet or service a need. Utility is about what the service does and is it fit for purpose. And then warranty, I wrote down here about it's the assurance piece. For me, it's always been about understanding what assurance the product or whatever it is that you are delivering, what what are the requirements, is it meeting those requirements, and again it was about how the service performs is what I kind of wrote down here, and is it fit for use. Customer is a role that defines the requirements for a service and takes responsibility for the outcomes of the service consumption. User is someone who uses the service. Service management is a set of specialized organizational capabilities for enabling value for customers in the form of services. Sponsor, the role that authorizes the budget for service consumption, can be used to describe an organization or an individual that provides the financial element or other support for an initiative. I've got a definition here around an asset. So an IT asset was any financial valuable component that contributes to the delivery of an IT product or service. Event, any change of state that has a significance for the management of a service or the configuration item. What's a configuration item? A component that needs to be managed in order to deliver an IT service. Change, I can't quite read my writing there. The addition, modification or removal of anything that could have a direct or indirect. Yeah, I underlined indirect because you don't always know. You do a change, you generally know what the direct impact is. You don't always know what the indirect impact or the effect on a service, and that's always a good question to ask at CAB. What it's a difficult one to answer. What don't you know that you don't know? But yeah, change is the addition, modification or removal of anything that could have a direct or indirect effect on services. An incident is an unplanned interruption to a service or a reduction in the quality of a service. In brackets I put here, note this opens up enterprise service management. Note the word IT is gone, which was in ITIL4. Problem is a cause or a potential cause of one or more incidents, and a known error being a problem that has been analysed, so you've looked at it but you haven't worked out how to resolve it. And then concepts around cost, so the amount of money you've spent on a specific activity or resource. And then I've got in brackets here, consider from a consumer's perspective. Think what have you taken away by for the consumer, and then what have you added in there. So think about cost remove and cost imposed, really is what that's about. Value is perception based, but it's the perceived benefits, the perceived usefulness, the perceived importance of something. So value thinking, balancing the outcome, so the affected outcome, against costs introduced and the risks introduced, versus the supported outcomes, the costs removed and the risks removed from the other side. So you've got those scales, if you like, that sort of balance between those two areas. Organisation, So typically a person or a group of people that has its own function with responsibilities, authorities and relationships in order to achieve its objectives. Outcome is a result. So it's a result for a stakeholder. It's a result that something's been enabled by one or more outputs. Think outputs help consumers deliver the outcomes. Output is a tangible or an intangible delivery of an activity. A risk is a possible event that could harm, or it could be a loss or make it more difficult to achieve your objective, and you can define it as an uncertainty of outcome. And you can be used in the context of measuring the probability of a positive outcome as well as a negative outcome. Again, I always like to think from your customer's perspective, from your consumer's perspective, from your customer, whoever's perspective you are delivering the product and the service to. Think from their perspective. What's it removed? What's it imposed? And in the context of risk, what risks have you taken away from me? What risks have you given me? Utility, again, what does the service do? And warranty is how it performs. So there are statements that, there are lengthy statements that ITIL4 talk through, and I encourage you to look at those in detail and understand the utility and the warranty. For me, just in my notes here, I'm noticing I've just put, you can summarize it as what utility is what the service does. So that's your fit for purpose bit, and then warranty is about how does it perform? Is it fit for use? Side note here, utility and warranty are essential to any service if you want to meet a desired outcome, which is usually value. So really important. So we've kind of covered the 7 guiding principles. We've talked about the service value system. The IT continual improvement model was about looking at the vision. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? And then taking action as a result of that. And then asking the question, did we get there? And then the ongoing cycle of how do we keep the momentum going back to the beginning? Well, we keep the momentum going by what is the vision? What's the business vision? What are the goals? What are the objectives? And then assessing where are we now? Do a baseline assessment. Look at what's the current state as is. Where do we want to be? Measure targets. Put targets in the first place. How do you know you've got there if you don't have a target? You need to aim at something. If you're doing archery, you need to define what the target is. How do we get there? So define the improvement plan. What are the steps to get there? Take action. Do something. Don't just have your action plan and look at it each week or each month. Do something. Execute. Look at improvement actions and activities. And then assessing, have we got there? Did we get there? Have you, hopefully, in one of your earlier steps, during your baseline assessment and your defining measurable targets, you've got some metrics in place and some KPIs, because how did we get there? Well, you only know that if you evaluate your metrics and your KPIs. And then it goes on. How do we keep the momentum going? Back to the beginning. What's the vision? We talked about the 4 dimensions of the service within an ITIL4 world, of the dimensions being organisations and people, information technology, partners, suppliers, value streams and processes, and all of those PESTLE factors: political, economical, social, technical, legal and environmental. The purpose of practices, so I'm not going to go into detail and go through the purpose of each one here, but I underlined, make sure I understood the purpose of information security, the purpose of relationship management, the purpose of supplier management, the purpose of asset management, the purpose of monitoring an event, and the release, service configuration, deployment, continual improvement, change control / change enablement, incident, problem, service request, service desk, and service level. Those are my my key learning points. I then made sure I understood the service value chain activity in terms of PIDOD and what each one of those meant, and I went through a few examples of my own from the organisation I was working with at the time. I worked it and got a pencil and mapped it through as to, let's just run this through. How did it go from the demand to the value, and going through that PIDOD. And then I looked at in a lot more detail the continual improvement practice and the model, the change control, the change enablement, incident, problem, service request, service desk, and service level management. That's pretty much the end of my notes. As I say, they were literally just notes I scribbled down as part of my study when I did the foundation exam. I hope you found that useful. If you do, please subscribe. I'm more than happy to continue to share information around ITIL4, SIAM, service management, and enterprise service management. Thank you.